Hello, welcome to the book event by Jill Wine-Banks, sponsored by the UNESCO Transatlantic Slave Trade Committee and the UF Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. My name is Elaine Sponholtz. For those who have not had a chance to read her book, The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President, I can tell you that Ms. Wine-Banks has written a very enjoyable memoir, which tells stories about the milestones of her life and career. By taking her readers through how she overcame the hurdles she faced and decisions she made, she has provided a role model for women and girls. Almost 50 years later, women continue to face similar challenges upon entering the workplace. Here's a brief overview of her career. After completing law school at Columbia University, she was one of the first female attorneys at the United States Department of Justice and worked for 4 years in the Organized Crime Division prosecuting mobsters. She proved her abilities through her courtroom skills and her win record. She was not yet 30 when she was hired to serve as one of 3 assistant prosecutors and the only woman on the obstruction of justice trial team of the Watergate Special Prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. During the proceedings, Ms. Wine-Banks cross-examined Rosemary Woods, President Nixon's secretary, about the infamous 18.5-minute gap on the Watergate tapes. You need to read her book to learn more about how she was able to catch Rosemary Woods in a lie. After Watergate, when she had become known for her fashion choices, especially her miniskirts, she joined a Washington, D.C. law firm. Her book details the sexism she faced there. In 1977, she was appointed as the general counsel for the U.S. Army by President Jimmy Carter and served until 1980. Her book details how she instigated the changes that made sure women had uniforms designed for their physiques. She also worked to integrate women into the regular Army and to eliminate the Women's Army Corps. She continued her work with the Pentagon in later years, focusing on ways to design new procedures to address sexual assault in the military. In 1987, she continued to act as a trailblazer by becoming the first woman to serve as the executive director of the American Bar Association. After leaving the ABA, she joined Motorola as a director and vice president in 1992 and has since had a series of positions as a corporate executive, including at Maytag. These are only some of her career highlights. After intending to be a journalist as an undergraduate communications major at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Jill Wine-Banks has now merged her early ambitions with her legal career and appears frequently on the MSNBC cable channel as a legal analyst or legal contributor. She is also the host of 2 widely distributed podcasts, Sisters in Law and iGen Politics, which I can recommend as well. In addition, I should note, due to her love of brooches and wearable jewelry, her favorite hashtag is #JillsPins. As a Florida native myself, a media history scholar, and someone who remembers that era, I listened intently to The Watergate Girl as an audiobook. It reminded me of the many connections that the Watergate scandal had to Florida. 4 of the 5 Watergate burglars were from Miami. For those who don't remember, the Watergate Break-In occurred on June 17, 1972, at the DC offices of the Democratic National Committee. A security guard notified police just before 3 a.m. after 5 burglars broke into the hotel and office complex named Watergate. The committee to re-elect the president had provided the $100 bills the men had stuffed in their pockets. Over 2 years, the ties to President Nixon were proven, and on August 8, 1974, he resigned. Jill's book reminded me that Richard Nixon had a residence on Key Biscayne, which the press dubbed the Winter White House. It was a location suggested by Florida U.S. Senator and Congressman George Smathers, a name well known on this campus due to the library that bears his name. As a native of Miami, I went to high school with classmates from Key Biscayne, a barrier island, who came to class by boat across Biscayne Bay, then used a car they parked on the mainland to avoid traffic jams on the causeway. They may have lived next door to Nixon's house, where he met with his friend and supporter, Cuban businessman Bibi Rebozo. And according to Rebozo, the two men were swimming together at Rebozo's home in June of 1972, when Nixon was informed of the Watergate Hotel break-in, and Rebozo said he was with the president on the night that Nixon resolved to resign the presidency. For me, the book also brought back memories of the days and weeks of live Watergate coverage on television, when other programming was preempted on the three main channels. Of course, there was also the glitchy Channel 6, which had programming like black and white Japanese sci-fi films with a giant octopus attacking the people on a causeway that looked suspiciously like the one to Key Biscayne, but that's beside the point. So as you hear our speaker talk about her experiences during the historic Watergate scandal, you may like to reflect on it as a story woven through with links to Florida. Ms. Winebanks can tell us what really happened during that time from the perspective of an insider, and how what she experienced relates to current events. For me, the story of Watergate is the story of a president who authorized a burglary of the office of his political rivals to collect dirt in order to win an election.
It's supposed to go to jail. And
even today, that this infamous event and the prosecution that followed reverberates in the words.
She's right there.
Okay.
But
I can hear you guys.
Okay.
Let her finish.
Okay. I'm not gonna, I just want to check what
That's Jill.
Even today, this infamous event and the prosecution that followed reverberates in the words of Reverend Raphael Warnock, senator from Georgia, when he observed last April, quote, "Some people don't want some people to vote," unquote. Thank you to Sherry DuPree and the UNESCO Transatlantic Slave Trade for making this event possible. And thank you to the esteemed scholars participating in the upcoming channel. So now I am pleased to introduce our speaker, former Watergate prosecutor, current media maven, and inspiring trailblazer, Jill Winebanks.
So back to the book, The Watergate Girl. And again, thanks to Elaine for that great introduction. I want to just introduce you to the book before we get to questions, which I always find to be the most interesting part of any episode that I have concerning the book, because what you want to hear about is what I want to talk about. But just to give you some background, the book was written to be my personal perspective of the Watergate scandal. I was the only woman involved, so it's a story that only I could tell. And when I say the only woman involved, I was the only woman on the trial team. There was another woman, Rosemary Woods, who had a pretty significant role. But I want to try to give you more than just a view of the trial, but also of the Watergate era. I want to talk about a time when democracy worked, justice prevailed, facts were agreed upon by all the public media, and there was bipartisanship. Compromise was not considered to be a bad thing. It was actually the way things got done. But it was also a time of blatant sexism, and stereotypes were rampant. And that brings me to the second theme of the book, which is a time when women had to overcome obstacles. For me, it was, of course, the obstacles of societal stereotypes and sexism, but it was also some internal insecurities that I had. And that was partly because the social expectations were so bad that it made me feel like an outsider. And because I was always the only woman in the room, I was an outsider. My original book outline covered only the story of Watergate and the scandal and all of the trial and the drama of the trial, and how my team worked on the investigation. But as I was writing down specific stories in an outline about that, I realized for the very first time in my life how much sexism had influenced my life, how much it had influenced my career, what impact it had. And so all the special stories I had to tell somehow involved sexism. And that's why I decided to include that, but also because in telling those personal stories, I'm able to tell how I overcame all of those obstacles put in my way, and hopefully help other people, men and women who have obstacles, give them clues on how they too can overcome them. It was a time when I became an unintentional trailblazer, and because the hurdles that I faced still exist, I'm hoping my solutions will help others overcome them. And let's look a little bit at how I became this unintentional trailblazer. My upbringing was just ordinary middle class. College was something that I knew I would go to. I didn't have any real career goals. I started out as an occupational therapy major. And the closest I've come to that is that my goddaughter is a physical therapist. But I ended up graduating with a degree in journalism, and then realized that the jobs I was offered were not the ones I wanted. I was offered jobs on the woman's page. And I wanted to report hard news. I wanted to report about trials or foreign affairs. And I decided that if I went to law school, it would help me get the kind of journalism job I wanted. So that's why I went to law school, not to be a lawyer. And of course, if I had thought about it, the discrimination in journalism was even worse in law. When I started in law school, less than 4% of all lawyers were women, and only 5% of my class were female. That's how it was. And hold on, I'm being told I need to move the camera. How was that? Is that better? Okay, thanks. In law school, I was asked questions when I first enrolled. My classmates would say, "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." It was during the Vietnam War. Someone is going to die in Vietnam because you took their rightful place in the class. And you'll never practice law anyway. So what are you doing here? In job interviews, I was asked what kind of birth control I used, which I guess is better than what Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Ginsburg got, because they couldn't even get job interviews. One of them had to start as a receptionist in a law firm. Ads then were labeled help wanted male, help wanted female. I didn't get my first trial at Justice. I started as a trial lawyer, but all trial lawyers at the Department of Justice start as appellate lawyers. We start handling appeals so that we will learn the mistakes that trial lawyers make, so that when we start trying cases, we don't make those mistakes and our cases don't get reversed. I realized after about a year that my male colleagues were starting to try cases and I was still arguing appeals. I had no women colleagues. I had no one to ask for advice. So I had to make up a solution. I went to the boss and said, "How come I'm not trying cases?" And he said, "Because you're a girl." Hence the title, by the way, Watergate Girl. You're a girl and you'd be much more vulnerable. In appellate court, you're just with lawyers. But in a trial, you'd be with made members of the mafia, and you'd be so much more vulnerable than men, which of course was not true. Although my first trial was in Alaska, and I had to wear a skirt when all the men got to wear flannel-lined pants. So I was, in a way, more vulnerable, at least to the weather. But anyway, it was by confronting him and saying, "I'm sorry, but you hired me as a trial lawyer and I want a trial," that I did end up in that case in Alaska. Then another member of the team said they had a trial in Boston and wanted me to help them with that. And I did that trial. And once that was over and they realized I had done fine, nothing happened that was untoward, I started trying cases on my own. And I made a lot of progress, I would say, because when I left the Department of Justice, I was given a party. This was to go to Watergate. And the gift that I was given at that party was a red Chinese box with 3 brass balls in it and a note that said, "Because you have more than most men." But I hadn't made that much progress, because when I got to Watergate on my first day, I was introduced to one of the key witnesses, Jeb Magruder, and I was with the senior trial attorney, Jim Neal, a junior trial attorney, George Frampton, and Jeb and his lawyer. And Jim Neal said, who would like coffee? And both Jeb and his lawyer turned to me and said, I'll take mine black. George Frampton, the junior lawyer, got up to get the coffee, and Jim Neal said, not very smart, insulting the person who's now responsible for negotiating your plea deal. So obviously, there was still a long way to go. And then, of course, I faced headlines that said, mini-skirted lawyer today questioned whoever it was. I did ask for water, but I didn't get any. That was a horrifying thing to see, that my clothing was described before what I said or did in court. Leon Jaworski always introduced me to his friends as a lady lawyer. And while I'm trying not to be too sensitive to words, that one really bothers me because it indicates that I am different than other lawyers, that I am a woman lawyer. I'm not. I was a trial lawyer. One of the most frequent questions I'm asked is, why did I write this book now? And there are three reasons. First, I was too busy before now because I had a great career and just didn't have time to write it. Secondly, I now saw parallels to current events that, of course, didn't exist until more recently. I started writing the book and really got serious once President Trump became president. And the parallels between Trump and Nixon made Watergate relevant again. And I don't mention Trump in the book until the epilogue, but I think that as you're reading it, you will see very striking examples of what was going on that is parallel. But also, I wrote it now because sexism is alive and well, and sometimes has even gotten worse, because when I was facing it, it was not illegal, which meant people were openly hostile and could say things like, well, we can't hire you because you're a woman, or we can't send you into trial court because you're a girl. But for those of you who, and Elaine mentioned my pins. I don't know, I'm gonna try to stand up so you can see the pin I'm wearing today, because it is sort of my favorite book tour pin. It shows a man and woman dancing with a woman dancing backwards in high heels. And to me, that represents the hurdles that were so significant in my life and that I hope my book will help answer. And I'm told that there are now questions, so I'm going to look forward to that.
Yeah, I was curious about Jill's encounters with Mark Felt, who was an FBI agent at the time and later became known as the famous Deep Throat, who guided Woodward and Bernstein through the event and famously told them to go ahead and follow the money. So I was curious what role, if any, he played in the prosecution.
Mark Felt, as said, was known as Deep Throat. He was the source of information, very significant information for Woodward and Bernstein in the early reporting of the Watergate scandal. And we, when I say we, I'm talking about the Watergate trial team, had no connection with Woodward and Bernstein. We never spoke to them because there was always the chance that someone would accuse us of having leaked something. A very important rule at the Department of Justice is that you do not share any information that you get through grand jury. And so I never met Bob Woodward or Carl Bernstein until after trial was over. However, of course, we were reading the Washington Post. We read about Deep Throat. We tried to figure out who Deep Throat was. And so we would read a report that said Deep Throat today said X. And then a week later, and he said Y. And then he said Z. And so we'd go through and say, well, who are the people who knew fact X? And we would write down a list. And then we'd go, who knew Y? And there'd be no overlap. And so then we get to Z, and there might be one person who knew one or the other, but didn't know all three. So we never were able to figure it out. And we thought Deep Throat was actually a code for sources, plural, that it wasn't one person because we couldn't find one person. Now, that means we obviously never thought about somebody high enough in the FBI that they were reading all of the FBI reports. So FBI agent A interviews witness 1 and Mark Felt reads it. Same thing with FBI agent 2, 3, 4, 5. He's reading all of these. So he had that source. But honestly, we never figured out that it was Mark Felt. Mark Felt was clearly important to the early reporting. And let me just say, there's a big difference between the role of the media, you know, Woodward and Bernstein, and Judge Sirica, who never believed when the burglars were on trial. He was also the trial judge for that, as well as for our obstruction case. He never believed it was just them who went in there on their own. I mean, just picture what it was like for all these fancy dressed men in fancy suits, carrying very expensive camera equipment, wearing surgical gloves, having $100 bills in their pocket. And that's where the follow the money came from. The first act of the cover-up was trying to get the CIA to say to the FBI, don't follow the money. All those $100 bills had serial numbers. They were the result of one of the burglars cashing a check in Miami at their bank. The burglars were, the largest group of them were Cuban Americans who lived in Florida, and one of them had cashed a campaign check. If they had followed the serial numbers, they would have seen that the campaign had paid them. Talk about proof beyond doubt that it wasn't just a burglary, that it was a political crime. That would have been it. So that was a very big clue. If you think about it, follow the money. And that, of course, is ultimately what happened. Now, there were other clues to the connection to the White House, things like Howard Hunt's name and White House phone number in the pocket of one of the burglars. That's another pretty big clue that somehow the White House was involved, not just the committee to reelect the president, known as CREEP. So that, to me, does that answer your question? I mean, so he was important, even though and nobody knew who he was until near his death, when he gave permission for his name to be revealed. And that's how we came to know that it was Mark Felt.
Let's check the chat and see if there are questions there.
Okay. Does any other panel member want to unmute and ask a question? Looks like Roger is going for it. Yes.
Yes.
Roger.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Introduce yourself so everybody knows, because the panel wasn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Roger Byrd. I'm associate professor of criminal justice and political science at Bruton Parker College in Georgia. And I remember Watergate as a college freshman, actually.
Actually,
well, you don't look it, so.
Well, thank you for making me feel good.
I actually remember I was introduced to it. I'd never heard about it. Newt Gingrich came to my college and spoke to the social science classes. And he was actually asked by a student about the Watergate break-in and what did he think of it. And in typical fashion, he used two words that I remember. One was despicable, and the other one was like, it was something, I can't remember, I think he said disgraceful, that we would have that. And I guess not anticipating where it was actually going, because he was an advocate for the Republican Party at that time, but long before Congress. My question is, where Barry Goldwater, the lions of the Republican Party actually persuaded Nixon to resign. When this got out of hand, it was obvious that it was. Why doesn't that happen? Could something like that happen today? forget the fact that we don't have, Everett Dirksen anymore or those guys. Would a president feel compelled today to actually do that right thing?
I can give you a very easy answer, which is no. But let me explain why I'm saying no. And this goes to when I was introducing the book, I was trying to portray a time when there was bipartisanship. Compromise was considered good. Getting something done was considered admirable. And it was a time when there were 3 networks. That was it. And they all had the same facts. Politicians debated solutions to agreed upon facts. Now we live in 2 alternate universes. I work for MSNBC, and those of you who watch me on that or watch any MSNBC believe a set of information that I believe is based on facts. It is based on reality. Those people who probably are not listening to this now, but if they were, if they watch Fox, OAN, Newsmax, they believe a completely alternate set of information. You cannot debate what the proper policy solutions are unless you agree on the facts. And then you can work on how to solve those facts. So things, for example, Nixon, obviously he committed crimes. I mean, it's unquestionable. The evidence is overwhelming, but I have reviewed the evidence against former President Trump, and the evidence is equally compelling of many indictable crimes. I don't know why it's taking the department so long to indict. I don't know why Bannon, unless it's happened since this morning, why he hasn't been indicted. There are just a lot of things that make it strange. And I would love to get back to a time when we all shared facts. I don't believe that's possible anymore. We're not going to undo social media where anyone can say anything and people will believe it if it fits their worldview. And, this pertains to so many things, but there were a set of norms that everybody observed back then. And now norms have been thrown away completely. Adam Schiff has proposed Saving Our Democracy Act, which hasn't gotten much attention. I mean, raise your hand if you've even heard of it. No, I don't see any hands going up. Anybody in this room? Yes, Elaine, good for you. Okay. Elaine and I and no one else have heard of this. It is to codify norms that we never thought would be violated. We never thought it would be necessary to have these in place. And now we do. I mean, you have an emoluments clause, but there's no penalty for the emoluments clause violations. So now we need to create one because it's a horrible thing to do. But if there's no penalties, how do you stop it? Even though it's in the Constitution. How do you make someone turn over their tax returns if it's not a law? It was a norm. And it's something America should demand. I want to know. Every voter should want to know. And so anyway, that's an important, change, I think. So we have to get back to somehow teaching critical thinking skills in schools. And many of you are university people. So I hope that in whatever subject matter you teach critical thinking, because without that, people just fall for and believe. And, it's things like the horrible results that just happened in terms of losing an election based on a critical race theory. You ask anybody who voted because they thought critical race theory was terrible, they say, what is it? They go, I don't really know. I just know it's bad. And the Democrats are for it. Democrats are not for or against it. It isn't taught in our schools. It's a law course. And it has, don't get me started on this because I'll really get worked up about it. But you get my point. We have to teach people to understand you can't vote against somebody because of CRT if you don't even know what it is. So that's my answer to that question. There are a couple questions here, but I'd like to take the panel first if there are other panelists who would like to unmute and ask a question.
Attorney Wine-Banks, we're going to, the panel has submitted some questions to me as the moderator. So when you're done with the audience, then I'll go over to them and have you join us at that time.
So you're getting the questions.
I do have a question though.
Okay, so Marvin, go ahead.
Yes.
Beverly.
Did you ever fear for your life?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Marvin Dunn. I'm a retired professor from Florida International University, and I've done a lot of writing on race relations. And I am 81 years old, and I remember you.
Thank
I was
you.
30, and I remember what you said. I remember what you did, and I remember your ministers too. I really do. And I enjoy you on MSNBC. I see you all, listen and watch you all the time. So thank you for being with us today, despite the technical difficulties. But did you ever fear for your life in all this Watergate business?
You know, it's interesting. Back then, I think we all felt safe. My home was burglarized, and the press corps asked the day after it was reported that I'd been burglarized, they asked at a press conference at the White House whether it was the plumbers, which is what the group of burglars was known as the plumbers. It was a unit within the White House that was intended to stop leaks, hence the name the plumbers. And that was bad. But what was worse was when the police came in response to my calling them to my house. Those days, there were no cell phones. So they asked if they could use my telephone to call a mobile crime lab to come out and do fingerprinting and stuff. And when the policeman got off, he said, I think there's some unusual resistance on your line, which to me meant it might have been bugged. And because as a prosecutor, I had the power to, a thing called Title III had just passed, which enabled the government to apply to a court for a warrant to put a wiretap on. And it was really intended mostly for the organized crime cases. And I was in the organized crime section, so I had used Title III. I immediately called the FBI, who was working with us on Watergate, and said, better get over here. And so they came and they sent a team in the next morning. And at a break in court, they called me into judge's chamber so they could talk to me privately, where they said they thought that there had been a bug on my phone, that it had been removed, and that this must have been the second burglary or second entry into my home. And even though as a prosecutor, I had used wiretaps and had gotten valuable evidence, and even though I had never had a conversation on my phone about Watergate because I was never at home to have it. Any conversations I had were at the office. I felt so invaded. I felt so threatened by that. And partly because those of you who read my book know that I did have a secret that I had to hide. And I was worried that there had been conversations that would have revealed that secret, which was personal, had nothing to do with, hurting the case, but would have been very destructive of me. So I was really, upset about that. It was during my time in the organized crime section, there was one time when I was trying a case in San Francisco against two mob hitmen. So, talk about if you're going to ever be afraid, hitmen would be the time to be worried about it. And one of them was trying so hard to get out of being tried that he actually ran into the street in front of a car and got hit, was taken to the hospital. Make a long story short, the judge was having none of this and said, call the hospital and find out if he has to stay in the hospital. And the doctor told me he would have to have his leg elevated, but yes, he could, as long as he sat and had his leg elevated. And the judge said, fine, we'll put a chair in front of him with a pillow on it. He doesn't have to stand when I come in, but he's going to go to trial. And in the course of having this get appealed, I had to reveal the hotel I was staying at. And this junior person on the trial with me was like, you can't tell the mafia where you're staying. They're already running in front of cars to avoid a trial, and you're going to tell them where you're staying? Are you crazy? And I was not afraid. Maybe my friends at Justice were right when they gave me the 3 brass balls, but I gave my hotel to them. They delivered the papers to us, and we argued and we won. And he went to trial with his leg elevated, and he didn't stand when the judge came in. So, but basically, no, I wasn't afraid. A very good friend of mine in Chicago, who's a federal judge, her husband and mother were killed. And so now the threat becomes much more real. And yes, I probably would be afraid now, but I wasn't then.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Marvin.
Sure. Okay.
Anybody else on the panel have a question? Laura, do you have a question? Or okay, so Beverly, you have some questions that came from the audience? Unmute yourself.
All right, well, thank you.
Yourself too, Beverly.
Thank you so much. I am happy to moderate the panel today. We've already met Dr. Byrd, Roger Byrd, but let me just introduce some of the others. And also, I want to make one correction on the screen about me. I wish I was on the Supreme Court of Georgia, but I'm really not. I'm a licensed certified mediator in the state of Georgia through the Supreme Court, through the Office of Dispute Resolution. So we want to make sure we get everything correct. But thank you so much. And Attorney Winebanks, thank you so much for being with us. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I'm telling you, I must have all different colors of tabs in this book. It was one that was very hard to put down. And I just want you to know I was very appreciative. Elaine, I agree with you that she is certainly a role model for women, and I underscored girls because the courage I saw in the book, the preparation that is missing so in young women and men today to be successful was very obvious throughout the book. And I want you to know you really touched me, and I'm sure most women who read the book, on how you very smoothly and just integrated your personal life in the book. That really touched me in a very special way, something that most women cannot do and find very hard to do, but you tied it in beautifully with what you were going through during your career. So for that, I was very grateful and thank you for doing that. Our panelists today, though, are very distinguished individuals in their own right. Ms. Laura McCarty, whom I've known for some time, continues to do wonderful things in the arts in the state of Georgia as president of Georgia Humanities, which is the state affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Laura holds degrees in English, French, and comparative literature from the University of Georgia and Wofford College. And I'm not going to read her last line because I want to use that later. Dr. Marvin Dunn, retired in 2006 when he, as he indicated, from Florida International University from the Department of Psychology. And he himself is quite an accomplished author with books like The Miami Riot of 1980, Crossing the Bounds, which he co-authored with Bruce Porter, Black Miami in the 20th Century, and The Beast in Florida, A History of Anti-Black Violence. He's also directed 3 documentary films, which we're going to talk later about another one, Dr. Dunn. Black Seminoles in the Bahamas, The Red Bay Story, Murder on the Suwannee River, and the Willie James Howard Story, and Rosewood Uncovered, which UNESCO has, TST, has a very close relationship. And Dr. Kenneth Ward is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Florida, our whole school today. Hello, Dr. Ward.
Hello.
With the Department of Political Science. He wrote in 2019, The Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism. Dr. Wall's research interests are religion and politics as it relates to cultural differences and social movements in public life and Judaism. But Dr. Wall's curriculum vitae is miles long. He's done phenomenal work throughout the country. My colleague, Dr. Roger Byrd, is Associate Professor of Social Sciences and Director of our prison programs at Bruton Parker College. And we're in the little town of Mount Vernon, Georgia. His recent book, you know I can never say this right, Syphilis No More, The Case for Prison Education, it's been nominated for the Best Book Award by the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. And before his career in higher education, I thought he'd be so appropriate on this panel. Dr. Byrd served 22 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, and he's also a children's author. He didn't put that in his bio, but he recently published some children's books, which are absolutely marvelous. But I want to start with the panel. I would like to start with Laura first, because Laura, you made a statement when you all sent your bios in. You made a statement in it that said that you recall that Watergate was the first political event that you remember from your childhood. What was that like? And did it influence you in any way as it relates to politics or politicians?
Thank you. It's great to be part of this today. Elaine, as she told the introductory story and made these connections to Florida, kind of hit on some of my journey. I mean, I was in South Carolina. I was in elementary school when the Watergate hearings were going forth. They preempted shows that I wanted to watch, and I was not happy about that. But my parents were interested in politics, and they talked to me about what was going on, you know, as you would talk to a third grader about it. And one of the things I remember was Barbara Jordan, and when she came up in your book, your descriptions of her, that made me remember, you know, the things that my mother said about Barbara Jordan as a sort of like a new Shiro. But the thing I realized so much from reading your book is that, you know, I have this kind of like life story of my 55 years, and, you know, Watergate is kind of like the beginning of it. And then you get into President Carter being elected, and he's from Georgia, and we knew people that were working on that campaign, and you get the rise of the religious right and the rise of Ronald Reagan. And of course, when he was elected, you know, my family had opinions about that. And so then just keep coming forward. Then you get into Clinton, and he's impeached, but he's not convicted. And then coming forward, and Trump is impeached, but he's not convicted. And what I realized is that, you know, as a kid, I really wasn't very aware of the legal aspects of it. And just the fact that there really was a vote by the House that he, you know, I don't think Nixon was impeached, but he was on the path to being impeached. And so that layer of the legal history of it really came through well. And I love what you said about the differences between our community today and the past, and sort of just thinking forward, what you said about alternative facts is definitely something that, you know, as a person who works in the public humanities, I have to try to deal with. And, you know, I mean, we're not political, we're for everybody, and everybody has a right, as you said, critical thinking and knowledge of it. And just, you know, even with the naming of the law that nobody's heard of that Mr. Schiff wants to put in, the Save Our Democracy Act, you know, is that going so far that it's just sticking a stick in the eyes of the other people who think, well, we understand it too, you know? So anyway, what you're saying is very relevant, and that's a little bit of where I came from with the story.
Can I add to something you said, and,
Sure.
and also comment? Roger said something as well, which was, it was Republicans who, well, let me start with, Nixon was not impeached by the House because there had been 3 articles of impeachment voted, bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans in the House had voted 3 articles of impeachment, but it never went to the full House because in the interim, on an expedited basis, which is possible, the Supreme Court, we went in April, we subpoenaed additional tapes for the trial, 64 tapes. By July, they had decided that we had a right to them, and we got them. And one of them was what was known as the smoking gun tape, in which you could hear what I referred to about the follow the money was, well, just get the CIA to stop the FBI. And there was also one which was well, $1 million, I know where we could get that. It would be wrong, but we can get it. And that, once that became public, it was Goldwater, as Roger mentioned, and the leader of the House and the Senate. They were in the minority, but they were the minority leader, Republicans, leaders of the House and the Senate. Scott and I'm forgetting the name, somebody else is going to have to look up who the three were, went to the White House and said, Mr. President, if you do not resign, you will be convicted in the Senate. There was no question that the House would have voted a full impeachment and that he would have been, and Nixon supposedly said, well, Senator Goldwater, I have your support, don't I? And he said, no, you don't even have my support. And just to make this even more personal, when he realized that he was finished, he had some sense of shame, which is something that is missing in former President Trump. And he also had enough respect for democracy in our system that rather than being forced out by being convicted, he decided to resign. But he went to Rosemary Woods and asked her to tell his wife and daughters. He was embarrassed to tell his own family. And the reason I point this out is, aside from the fact of how influential she was in my career, it really shows why I came to respect her in a funny way, because she was not just what was then known as a secretary. Secretaries don't even exist, but that was a very, somebody who just took dictation and typed. And in those days, it was dictation where somebody took shorthand. Something I, by the way, know how to do. And she was an advisor to him. She was someone he respected. She was much more than just someone who took dictation. So that's why I mentioned that as part of what you mentioned.
All right. Thank you so much. Dr. Wald.
I've already asked my question, so why don't we go on to the other panel members?
Dr. Byrd, let me ask of you. Mentioned why she started writing her memoirs, and as she thought about what went on with former President Trump and whatever. So when I got to page 225 of her book in the epilogue, where she starts giving this parallel, it was interesting because, again, I was so enthralled with the book itself. And then when it just switched to that, it was in the back of my mind, but I never even thought it, and just definitely thought it would just pop out at me when I got to the epilogue. But how do you parallel that, and how do you think it may have influenced power with presidents today? How do you parallel Nixon to former President Trump?
Well, I think
what's the power of presidents today?
Well, I think it kind of ebbs and flows. I think we didn't mind having a strong president as long as he was doing good. I think Watergate really soured us on presidential power for a while, and I think it reflected and sort of rippled through society in many ways. I think some of the things that culturally we saw after Watergate and after actually was significant. The one area that I have been surprised that is in the faith community. The faith community still seems to cling tightly to, even after, we remember Billy Graham basically endorsed President Nixon. It was almost like a revelation, an epiphany. And then there was this huge disappointment, but the faith community still clings fairly tightly to that strong president kind of thing. I'm not exactly sure what that's all about. And as a Baptist myself, I struggle with that. I think in society generally, our view of presidential power changed a lot. We were not so, and we passed some things to prevent the next Watergate, and we have slowly dismantled those. But I think it affected my view of politics and people that practice it. It helped me come to this conclusion that politics is less about policy with most people that are in it. It's about power. It's about how, what must I do to stay in power? And it is justified so often by saying, well, I can't really do all the good that I want to do unless I can stay in power. So therefore I have to do some nasty things to retain power so I can do good. I mean, it's a convoluted way of justifying it. I rambled a little bit there, Dr. Robinson.
That's okay. Your comments reminded me of a comment made to me once by the former president of the NAACP of the state of Florida, the late Mr. T.H.C. Pugh Sr. And he said to me once when we were talking about politicians, he said, well, politicians do things so that they can win the next time. Doesn't have to be right. And that makes a whole lot of sense. But I want to go to our historian, Dr. Dunn. Dr. Dunn, as a historian, tell me, can you compare, or in any major event, we have to sort out the truth of what happened versus the story we are told. So as a historian, how do you think our perception of Watergate has fared in the truth versus story area?
Oops, the last part of your question was garbled. Yeah. The last part was garbled.
Okay, my last part was, how do you think our perception of Watergate has fared in the truth versus the story area?
Good question. Well, I think the truth has prevailed in Watergate. I think we found out what happened. I think for the reasons that Jill mentioned, partisanship and other reasons, the truth was not hidden in Watergate. And that is to the credit of our country and to journalists primarily. Now, it distresses me greatly that truth becomes questionable. Who would have thought that we would be debating whether the sky is blue? But let a Republican say it's blue and we'll say it's green, or vice versa. I am so distressed by this. I spent 7 years in the military as a naval officer protecting my country. I never thought that I would come to the point in my country where I was embarrassed at being an American, and that's where I am right now, and it saddens me. I'm reaching out. I guess I'll just admit it. I'm reaching out to Republicans. I decided last night. These people that I really, I won't say I don't hate anybody, resent their politics. I have to get beyond that. I've got to put my own anger aside to do my part to bring our country together. And I'm as mad at DeSantis and Trump as anybody else on this call. But I got to stop doing that. And Watergate is a good example. I'm glad you asked that question of how we can go through a very troubled time and come out of it as a unified country. But we have to agree on what's true in order to get to that point. And so I think at this point, I'm going to stop throwing rocks and stones as I have for 4 years at Trump and all his people and try to talk to people. We've got to talk, because after talk comes fighting, comes war. And at this point, we need to be talking to each other.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful comment, and I agree. It's something that we all should do. We should start talking about these issues, because it is through talks and action that changes things. But I do want to say that Watergate is interesting. The generations, we probably could go back for at least 3 to 5 generations. I see you, Dr. Byrd. And they have no idea. It has truly amazed me. The last 3 to 5 generations, they have no idea of the struggle, of Dr. Martin Luther King. You can even go and ask them that. They have no idea. When I was in school, and many of you as well, we had to know who the presidents were. They can't name them. They know Barack Obama. They know those who made some type of historical prevalence as it relates to them and what they're interested in today. But we had to know who the presidents were. We had to know something significant about all of them. But most importantly, we had to learn to get through adversity. And that is something when Attorney Banks said, critical thinking. We do not teach critical thinking. So the way to critical thinking is violence and anger. And that's not critical thinking, that's reacting. So wonderful comments and answer to that question. Dr. Byrd, you have a comment?
Well, just real briefly, we have to be very, I think the debate of the truth versus fiction actually affects us in more than just our politics. For instance, I teach a course on race and ethnic relations as it relates to criminal justice. And I have to be very careful, because I know, my students and their parents are getting their news, some of them at least are getting their news from OAN or something like that. And I'm not teaching critical race theory. As a matter of fact, I confess, I didn't even know what it was. And I'm not sure now. But I have to be very careful in what I teach so that you don't end up losing the focus on the course and the learning, and becoming distracted with some red herring. And so I think it's and I must tell you, I'm concerned with what I'm seeing in school boards, that they're really under attack right now, and so they're really being threatened. So it's real. The struggle is real, as we say. Lots of things are happening, and they're filtering down to us at this level.
That's correct. Laura, I saw you put a question up. Do you want to?
Well, my question sort of along this line of history and story is to what extent do you think that the public in general remembers the history of Watergate vis-a-vis All the President's Men? And probably, I mean, the movie of All the President's Men even more than the book or the journalism that they published in the Washington Post.
And, I think that's why I was so glad that this book was published, because a lot of it is still surreal today. And you're right. When I got to the President's Men, even to me, then it all clicked and started coming back. And so, yes. And then when I looked at it, I said, oh my goodness, this is recent. So it was just wonderful that things happen at the right time in life. They always do. I'm a firm believer of that. And this is a timely book.
Can I add to what Laura said?
Yes.
Also to her earlier comments. Well, first of all, there isn't really a difference between All the President's Men and Truth, because it is truth. It was a pretty accurate portrayal. Now, if you get to the movie, obviously movies get jazzed up in some ways, but it basically was reality, as opposed to what we are now living in, which are these silos of information and misinformation, disinformation. And so that nowadays, depending on your sources of information, you may be living in a remember, we have alternative facts now. Anybody who knows, there is no such thing. A fact is a fact, and there is no alternative to it. There are policy differentials that can come from a fact, but you have to accept the fact. And what you were saying earlier about your attitude toward the power of the president, for me, I was raised in a family that respected government, respected the president, even if it wasn't the person that you had supported. And my family, they considered themselves independents, but they basically always voted Democrat, I'm sure. But I do remember, and when you're asking earliest political memories, I have two. One was Adlai Stevenson, who was from Illinois, when he ran for president and lost the second time. I was only in third grade, but I remember he said, "It hurts too much to laugh and I'm too old to cry." And I don't know why, I still remember that. It was a big moment in my political upbringing. But I also remember my parents talking about Richard Nixon when he was running against Helen Gahagan Douglas. And they used words that I didn't understand back then. They said, basically, he was anti-Semitic. And words that I just knew they were bad. It's sort of like people saying, well, I know CRT is bad. I don't know what it is. But of course, I grew up to understand what it was. And I know what CRT is. And I know it's not taught in the schools. So I came to Watergate not expecting that I would find significant evidence of criminality by the president. And I also came, with this high degree of respect. And then the first time when we got the first set of tapes and listened to the first tape, it was devastating because there it was. You could hear the president of the United States in the Oval Office saying these horrendously criminal things. Mm-hmm. And for a while, it shook my faith in government and sort of, well, the president's just a man, and hopefully someday a woman, although we hope the women will behave better than the men. But you get my point. I mean, it was a devastating thing to hear the reality that it's just a person and not always acting in the best interests of the country. And we've seen plenty of evidence in the Trump administration of criminal conduct, and yet there are no consequences. And a democracy without consequences can't survive. So I think we have to, take some action.
Jill, may I ask a question, Jill?
Yes, please.
If the former President Trump is found guilty of criminal behavior, should he be sent to prison? Should America imprison a former president?
That's a question beyond my rank, I think. There's a part of me that is still Pollyanna naive, who says guilt is guilt, and yes. And let me say, during Watergate, I felt that the Office of Legal Counsel was wrong, that a sitting president is indictable, and that when they are guilty of crimes, they should be. I certainly believe that Richard Nixon should have been indicted after he resigned and was just an ordinary citizen. I certainly think that Trump, assuming the evidence is exactly as we have seen in the public, and there's a difference between what you get in a grand jury and how compelling it is, but assuming it's anywhere near what we're seeing in public, yes, he should be indicted and he should be convicted and barred from ever darkening our door again, from ever running for office. Frankly, the 14th Amendment says that anybody who is involved in an insurrection against the authority of America cannot serve ever again in public office. And to me, that's the end of it. He can't run again. I don't know what proof. That doesn't require proof. It doesn't require conviction. I think for me, the more important thing than him going to jail is him being bankrupted, being convicted in civil cases that are pending, and never being able to run for president.
But I can hear throughout Black America people saying he got to break the law, and because he's the former president, he doesn't go to prison, and we would have to go to prison if we did the same thing. What is that going to do for our sense of fairness and justice if the president can't be or won't be sent to prison if he's convicted of breaking the law?
It's the same thing. I'm from Illinois, which is adjacent to Wisconsin, and the Rittenhouse trial is going on. Here's a white kid, 17 years old, carrying an AR-50 or AR-47, I guess it was, kills 2 people, injures a third, and walks past the police who say, go home. If that kid were Black, he would have been shot. And we have so many problems in America. Minnesota just turned down reforming the police, and I am not for defunding the police. I am for improving them. And Dr. Dunn, and I, at one point in my career, was head of career and technical education for the Chicago Public Schools, which includes the prison schools. So I'm with you on, you know, prison education and how much we have to do in that regard. But, and if anybody hasn't seen MSNBC's special called Civil War, which is not a history of the Civil War in the 1800s, it really starts more in the 1950s and integration. I read White Fragility and I rejected it. I'm not that person. I'm not guilty of that. And my parents sent me to a Y camp when I was a little kid because I grew up in a white Jewish middle-class neighborhood, but they wanted me to know that the world wasn't what my environment was. And so I was a minority at that camp, but I was too young to have any preconceived notions. So to me, people were, you're either good at making a lanyard, if anybody remembers what a lanyard is, or rowing a canoe or swimming or whatever it was, then I liked you. If you weren't good at those things, maybe I wouldn't. And it didn't have anything to do with, so I was like, I'm not the person in White Fragility. Watching this Civil War documentary on MSNBC, I went, I think I finally get it. The war ended and slavery ended, but white supremacy didn't. And again, Rittenhouse is to me, how he walked away from that. And now he suddenly, well, I was defending myself against looters and rioters and arsonists, and I was afraid for my life. He was the one carrying an automatic weapon. But so I basically, I agree with you. And in an ideal world, yes, he would go to jail. Does he get Secret Service protection in jail? That's an added cost we have to bear. I certainly think he's guilty and he deserves every punishment. What's happened to his audit? He was under audit in 2015 when he announced. No audit takes that long. Why is that not over? And he's not in, I can understand why it didn't end while he was president. He controlled IRS. He's out of office. What's happened to IRS? If it was you or me, the audit would be over and we'd be having to pay back millions. Well, you and I wouldn't have to pay back millions, but if we were him, we'd have to pay it back. So what's going on? I agree with you. I do. There is something unseemly, and there is this political thing. I personally think that it's worse politically not to indict him than it is to indict him. I don't care what the political consequences are. They're worse. I feel the same way about filibuster. I think we have to get rid of the filibuster. The fact that the Senate again voted down voting rights. And if you want to worry about something, I'm worried about all the changes that limit and suppress the vote. But I'm more worried about the secretaries of state being denied the power to count the votes and turning it over to the state legislatures to decide if there was fraud when there's no evidence of fraud. That's very scary to me. And I think we all ought to be fighting to get rid of those laws. And those of you who are from Georgia have a lot to worry about. Those of you who are from Florida have a lot to worry about. I'm lucky to be from Illinois, but even we aren't exempt. And, women's rights are at issue now. I fear that the Supreme Court will overturn Roe versus Wade, and then what's going to happen and what's next. And if the Texas law is allowed to stand, think about all your rights and how they could be taken away by having civil enforcement by any citizen in the United States. It's horrible. And we have a lot of things to worry about. For one of my two podcasts, I have one hashtag sisters-in-law and one that's an interview format called iGen Politics, which is I do with an 18-year-old UCLA sophomore. And we interview some of the most interesting people. And we've interviewed several people. Recently, this week was Fiona Hill about democracy and she basically said, you know, this is 1930s in Germany. And they were saying it can't happen here. It can happen here. And so we all need to be taking defensive steps to make sure that we protect our democracy. And yes, getting rid of the filibuster to me is easy because it's a Civil War relic that was never intended to help democracy. Majority rule is hurt by it. You have, you know, enough senators who represent 25% of the population that control and rule out the majority. 75% don't get a say because this small little group can stop any legislation. And if we lose voting rights, well, then where is our democracy? So, okay, I'm off my soapbox now.
That was a good soapbox. Panel, we have time for just one more reaction to the book talk today. And I'd like
Can I ask what I don't mean to take yours away, but I was just going to say, has anybody talked to you about doing a film of your book?
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
I hope so. That'll be great.
It's been optioned for a film. You know, there's a long way between the option and an actual production, but Katie Holmes has optioned the book and wants to play me, obviously wearing a blonde.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And I've talked to the screenwriters that she hired, and they're fabulous. They did a series called Feud, which was Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. And even though they're men, they completely get sexism and misogyny. And I think they will do a good job. So hopefully it will actually become a film, I hope.
Excellent, excellent. Panel, I'd like for us to end our discussion today on talking about gender bias, because so much was discussed through her book, and she termed it better than I did, that the fact that it was openly hostile. What are your thoughts on that today? And I know we've been trying to improve it for centuries, but what are your thoughts on gender bias today, particularly as it relates, of course, to females, and recommendations on how we can move that forward? Dr. Wall, we'll start with you.
I'm sorry, the question was about gender bias.
Yeah.
I didn't get the last part of it.
Yes, and how can we push that needle a little forward? I know we've been trying for centuries, but Dr. Banks' book just brought it all back to the forefront, that is still today a prevalent issue.
You know, I have two daughters, and I'm married to an academic, and my wife always talks about the different conditions when she walked into a classroom from when I walked into a classroom. And there's no doubt that, you know, male privilege certainly kicks in. But what I have been impressed by, and I don't know that this is a general argument, is simply that the experience of encountering women in positions of authority, women of competence and skill and the like, I think is an extremely powerful form of education. And that doesn't mean we don't need to be aggressive in enforcing laws against such bias and following policies that will promote the employment of women. But I think that those examples are just extremely powerful teaching experiences for our students. And I have a lot of faith that as women, you know, achieve equality ultimately in the workplace, that attitudes will also change.
Okay, well, I see that we've been given a signal that we need to end the session. So I want to say to all the ladies who are watching, we need to remain bold and stern and speak up for our rights, as we have read in the book. And if you've not read the book and don't know how to do that, then I think you need to read the book, because she gave us a lot of tips on how to be bold and stand up as women, particularly if we are just as educated as our male counterparts. So I'm going to turn everything over to our director, Mrs. Sherrod DuPree.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I wish to thank you all. You did a wonderful job in sharing history. And thank you for being here, for taking the time out to read and be a part of this book talk. This is our second book talk. The first one was done with in 2015, and that was done with Malcolm X's daughter, who came into Florida and did a book talk for us. But today we want to thank all of you for what you have done. I also wish to thank our sponsors. The sponsors are as follows: the Alachua County Public Library, Alachua County Public Schools, Asa Philip Randolph Organization, Attorney Virgil D. Hawkins Civil Rights Foundation out of Tavares, Florida, Black History Tours out of Miami, Clayton Photography out of Melrose, Displays for Schools out of Gainesville, Florida, DuPree Holiness Pentecostal Center, Gainesville, Florida, Gifts of Freedom and Blog Talk Radio out of New Jersey, Hands of Change, Lake City, Florida, Howard Academy, Ocala, Florida, Rosewood Forum, Gainesville, Rosewood Heritage Foundation, Miami, Youth Training Program out of Hawthorne. These are the so many programs and others that we work with from time to time to make sure we keep the history of all of our lives in place for others to gain knowledge and know about. I want to say also that for those of you who attended today, we have a certificate, and we can make this available to you as an attendance that you spent at least an hour or two with us in dealing with the history of the Watergate. And the certificate reads, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, Transatlantic Slave Trade, awarded to the attendees, and we will put your name in there. In recognition of the satisfactory completion of book talk and discussion on Attorney Jill Wine Banks, The Watergate Girl, My Flight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President, November 5, 2021, Gainesville, Florida. The members of the United Nations group, myself, Beverly Robinson is the assistant, Geraldine Thomas out of Orlando, representative, Eric Albora has several businesses in Miami, Elaine Edwards, Colonel Elaine Edwards, PhD, Seville Brown out of Tampa, St. Pete area, and Leslie Guest out of New Jersey. These are our board members, and we wish to thank each of you for taking your time today to be a part of our book talk. And we must thank the University of Florida because we are here in their facility. And this is the facility of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. And I work here as a volunteer, just as a volunteer, to do interviews from time to time of people that are in need of interviews. And we know that we must interview them before they leave this good earth. So we want to again thank you and let you know that education is paramount with us. We're also very involved in culture. I will mention a couple of other quick things is that we have been involved in several educational activities and cultural tours. We travel, we take students from place to place, adults and all individuals that are interested. We work hard to make sure we keep the history of our culture alive. And we deal a lot with atrocities not only in Florida, but all over. Up in Georgia, and right now we just got done working with the Shepherd family and others with the Groveland 4. And Beverly, would you make a quick statement to let the people know what happened with the Groveland 4 case?
Well, I will say this. Let me give the good part. Our state attorney has determined that the incident never occurred.
Right.
And on yesterday, we received a date from the judge on November 22nd, 9:30. We will be at the Tavares Courthouse. Prayerfully, and we're very confident, we'll get an opinion from the judge that all 4 members of the Groveland 4 are clear of the incident.
Excellent.
That will remove a very dark mark out of Florida's history.
Absolutely. And this is what we do. We deal with so many atrocities. Right now we have the Newberry 6, and we just got through doing a historic marker, but the play starts tonight. This is Friday. And it's going to run for a week. And it's going to give the history and show what happened with the Newberry Six. We are all over the country in the sense of dealing with atrocities. I have another one in Arkansas that we're dealing with, and that was the Elaine massacre. And that was one that was not covered very well. But anyway, we won't go there in detail. The point of it is we thank you for being here today. We hope our students and young people can gather some knowledge from what you all have shared, because you've given your hearts to this today. And we say thank you. And also we want to thank the audience who came and participated with us. I see a few other hands up there waving. I saw Greg from the Rosewood Foundation. I saw a couple of other names that I don't want to start naming because there are too many people that are online, but we thank you and we hope that you have a wonderful day. And last, I need to say, we do apologize for not coming on time. We had a very bad storm here in Gainesville, and it has turned some of our systems out. We couldn't even use the phones part of the time. So we have had some interruptions, and we're glad those are over. Plus, we just had some other issues that we could not handle in the beginning. But we thank you for your time and patience and staying with us. Have a blessed day. Bye.